Welcome back to MVM. Today we're going to be taking a look at Transmissions. This is a game from designer Adam West and Crosscut Games, and it's based on the artwork and really the illustrated world from artist Matt Dixon. It's a 2 to 4 player game of gathering ideas, enhancing robots, building pipe structures, and all sorts of other things around a shared rondel. As you can see, we have the game set up here for 3 players, and the rondel is a track that goes around the entire board with these 4 robots that are going to move around it, effectively activating different sections of the board. Now, it must be noted this is a prototype, so the final game may be a little bit different, and one thing in particular are these miniatures have been hand painted, and that is not going to be the case in the campaign itself. And as I said, players are going to be moving these robots around the track, activating these different sections. For instance, they might collect engrams, which are effectively a resource of 4 different colors that you'll use in the game to acquire a number of different things. One of those things might be items or ideas for your robot. You could potentially gain electricity up at the top of the board, or forest cards, which will have usually a one-time effect to gain some sort of resource or benefit you in some way. And then finally, down here in the lower right-hand side of the board, you're going to see pipe sections. You're going to be taking those pipe sections to actually build a pipe structure next to your player board. And on the player board itself, you're going to find 4 columns representing each of the 4 robots on the board. This is where you're going to be placing ideas and items to potentially enhance your robots and progress towards the end of the game. As well, you're going to find a collection or your personal supply of engrams at the top of the board. Note that you can only hold 7 of those engrams, so resource management is definitely a part of this game. And finally, each player is going to have the same 7 transmission cards. These are the cards you'll effectively use throughout the game to move the robots around the board. There are 4 that each represent one of the robots, and 3 more that represent different areas of the board, and you'll understand how that works a little bit more in a second. Before the game begins, each player is going to get their player board, 1 of each of the 4 colored engrams, a starting pipe tile for that pipe structure, their 7 transmission cards, and finally 2 starting idea tiles. These are going to be randomly dealt out at the beginning of the game, and each player can either place 2 of them on any one of their robots or 1 on any 2 robots. These idea tiles and others that you might collect throughout the game are going to enhance your use of the robots on the board. So if you move this robot, you might be able to do a few more actions than you normally would if you have idea tiles. Each player is going to draw a hand of 3 of their transmission cards, and then the rulebook suggests that the player who most recently received a text is the start player. This is effectively going to be the youngest player at the table, I think. On your turn, you must move 1 robot, and then you may take 1 action. To do this, a player is going to simply choose one of the cards in their hand and play it in order to move the robot. If it's a robot card, you'll simply take that specific robot and move it the number of spaces on the robot's card. You'll note that each of the 4 robots have different movement speed. This one can only move 2 spaces, while these 2 can move 3, and finally this one can move 4 spaces. So for example, if I played this card, I would have to move this robot, and I can move him up to 3 spaces, but I must at least move him 1 space. There's another interesting note about movement that you need to pay attention to, and if I moved him his full 3, I'd go 1, 2, and the 3rd space would share a space with another robot. You can't do that in this game, so in that case, he would actually leapfrog over to the next space. You can use this ability throughout the game to get a little further with your robots than you typically would. After this movement, I would simply look at the location I'm at, which is up here with the electricity, and take 4 electricity into my supply. You may also use any idea tiles associated with that robot on your player board. In this case, I have this idea tile, which allows me to trade 2 electricity for a blue engram. So in this case, I could have moved, gained the electricity, and then 1 time traded in 2 of those electricity to gain a blue engram to my player board. So you can see, the more idea tiles that you add to any given robot on your player board, the more powerful and efficient that robot's probably going to be for you. Now let's say I didn't have that specific robot card in my hand at that moment, but I did have this card right here. This one's not associated with any given robot, but it lists 2 of the areas on the board from which I can move any robot I want. So I could play that card and use the top portion to identify a robot in this section and move him just as I did before. And those 2 examples should really give you a good idea of how movement works generally throughout the game. Now, let's talk about each of the sections on the boards and what they do. There are 2 areas on the board where you can get engrams: the lake and the meadow. You'll see that in the lake you can either take 1 blue engram or 2 white engrams, whereas in the meadow you can get 1 green or 2 yellow. And as I said, engrams are the main currency in the game. There's electricity too, but engrams are going to be used to get items, some of the ideas, and definitely those pipes. The next section we'll talk about is the power station. This is at the 12 o'clock position on the board and the one I used in my example earlier. When you land on one of these 2 spaces, you're simply going to be able to collect 4 electricity. And electricity is that secondary currency. You're going to be using it in some way to get the items and the ideas, but also to power some of the things you're doing on your player board with those ideas. In the forest, you're going to be collecting forest cards. Now when you do this, you're going to take 2 cards and keep 1. Now you can take them from the top of the deck, or you can also take them from the top of the discard pile so you have some knowledge of what you're getting. Once you have 2 in your hand, you're going to keep 1 and then discard the other. These cards can be used at any time and as many as you want on your turn. They have a variety of different effects. This one, for example, will give you 1 blue and 1 yellow engram. This one will give you 6 electricity. This one lets you take 2 engrams, each of any color, but only after you've taken your action in the lake specifically. And this one's pretty powerful. It allows you to immediately take another turn with a robot of your choice. To gain items, which are the bigger tiles to place on your player board, you're going to have to go to town. When in either of these 2 spaces, you're allowed to buy 1 item by spending the engrams on the item and the electricity listed beneath it. Once taken, you'll add it to any one of your 4 robots on your player board, covering up 2 of the spaces shown. Now, unlike ideas, these items don't really enhance your robots as you use them throughout the game, but they are going to give you some end-of-game scoring. Some items are just individual scoring opportunities like this one for 4 points, whereas others are going to inspire you to collect sets of items. In this case, if you have 1 of these, you'll get 1 point, but for the 2 that we have here, you'll get 5 points each. And it's just a quick trip through the meadow from town to get to the scrapyard. This is where you're going to be collecting ideas for your robots, and it works in a very similar fashion to town. When in the scrapyard, you can gain 1 of the ideas shown by paying the electricity in the lower right-hand corner, noting that these 2 also require either a yellow or white engram to acquire. And as I've said, ideas are also going to go on your player board, and these are the things that are going to enhance your robots to make them even better. These will only cover up 1 space, but there's a couple of things to keep in mind about both these and the items. First, once you've acquired and placed either of these tiles on your player board, they cannot be moved. They are there for the rest of the game. And second, regardless of whether you buy an item or an idea, both tiles in the column of the display will be removed. For example, if I were to buy this item and add it to my player board, to refill the display, I will first remove this idea, then shift these tiles down and refill in these spots. And we haven't talked about endgame triggers yet, but this is one of them. Once the game has run out of items and ideas and this display can't be refilled, that will end the game. And the last area of the board is the pipes area. To buy a pipe from this section, you'll discard the indicated 3 engrams and connect that pipe to one of your existing pipes in your structure. There's a very puzzly nature to building your pipe structure, which will become clear when we go over scoring at the end of the game. But just know that when you add a pipe to your structure, you obviously have to connect it to the right connection. If you aren't able to or don't want to connect a pipe to your structure, you can simply place it off to the side face down. That's only going to score you 4 points at the end of the game, which may not be as much as you could had you connected it to your structure. And you'll see there are 4 different stacks of pipes. When you acquire one, you're simply going to take the top one off of any one of the stacks, and you can potentially empty one of these stacks, which brings us to another endgame trigger. So let's talk about all of the endgame triggers. The first is if you can't refill the item or idea display with new tiles. The second is if any one of the 4 pipe stacks is completely emptied. And that brings us back to the player board, because if any one player happens to fill up all 4 of their robots with a combination of items and ideas, that too will end the game. And no matter how the game is ended, that player doesn't get any more turns, but everyone else at the table gets 1 more turn. And then it's time for final scoring. First, players will take a close look at their pipe structure for birds and butterflies. You're going to take the number of birds and multiply them by the number of butterflies and get that many points. Next, you'll simply score the points indicated on each pipe section of your structure, as well as any that you turned face down. And finally, with the pipes, there is a scaled scoring for the longest pipe section in your structure. Next, take a look at your player board and gain points for every robot that you've completely filled with items and ideas. Then look to your items and score the points on those cards, remembering that some are individual points while others are points that are going to scale with collected sets. And finally, there are a couple ways to score points with the forest cards. Some forest cards will have points printed on them in and of themselves, but everyone is going to be taking a look at how many acorns they have at the bottom of some of their forest cards. Each player will add up all of their acorns, and players with the fewest number of acorns each gain 5 points. And the player with the highest score, of course, wins the game. Now, if there is still a tie, you are going to go back to those acorns because the player with the fewest acorns will break that tie. And that's Transmissions. This is a rondel style, I'd say family-friendly Euro game where you're going to be collecting lots of resources, spending these resources to buy a variety of different things. And it has some really creative and inventive ways of scoring your points. Those butterflies and the birds. I've never seen anything like that. So if you have any questions at all, please make them in the comments below. We'll try our best to answer them. And until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then. Congratulations, you got to the end of one of our videos. Now, if you want more practice, just click on the video over here. It's another video. You might not have seen it yet, so click on it. If you don't want to do that, at least click on the subscription button below. That always helps us. And if you want notifications, please ring that bell.